Few names in history have inspired as much horror and mystery as Moloch. Ancient writers accused him of receiving the sacrifice of children. But who or what was Moloch? Was he truly a god? Was he merely the name of a ritual, or was he a lesser divine being acting on behalf of something greater? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all is this: why would parents offer their own children? Why would mothers and fathers sacrifice the very lives they had brought into the world? Because if these people loved their children just as much as we do today, then something must have convinced them that such a terrible act was worth it. And that is where the mystery of Moloch truly begins. The first mention of Moloch appears in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21, where the Israelites are commanded not to give any of their children to Moloch. Then again, in Leviticus chapter 20, the punishment for such an act is death, the highest form of punishment prescribed under the law. The text states that not only the person performing the sacrifice was guilty, but even those who tolerated it. This shows that whatever Moloch worship involved, it was considered one of the gravest sins imaginable. The prophet Jeremiah later mentions a place called Tophet in the valley of Ben Hinnom. Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 31 declares, "They have built the high places of Tophet in the valley of Ben Hinnom to burn their sons and daughters in the fire." Jeremiah chapter 19 repeats the accusation. And according to 2 Kings chapter 23, King Josiah eventually destroyed Tophet in an attempt to put an end to such practices. Over time, the valley of Hinnom, also known as Gehenna, would become associated with divine judgment and eventually with the concept of hell itself. But this raises another question. Was Moloch even a god? Or was Moloch something else entirely? Scholars continue to disagree. Some believe Moloch was an actual Canaanite deity. Others argue that the word Moloch referred not to a god, but to a particular kind of sacrifice. According to this interpretation, people were not sacrificing to a god named Moloch. Instead, they were performing a ritual known as a Molech sacrifice. And if this theory is correct, then another mystery emerges. If Moloch was the name of the sacrifice, who exactly was the god receiving it? Even today, historians and biblical scholars continue to debate the issue, and no clear answer has emerged. Interestingly, nearly every biblical reference places special emphasis upon sons and daughters. It is specifically upon the sacrifice of children, and perhaps that is why Moloch became so infamous. Later Jewish traditions and ancient writers began describing Moloch as a bronze image. According to some accounts, the idol resembled a bull. Fire would be lit beneath it. Its arms were said to stretch outward, receiving the child before the sacrifice took place. Some later traditions even claim that drums were beaten loudly to drown out the cries of the children. However, it is important to note that these details come from later Jewish and classical traditions. They are not directly described within the Bible itself. Modern culture has introduced another image, the owl. For many people today, Moloch is associated with an enormous owl statue because of the famous Bohemian Grove and the many speculations surrounding the rituals said to take place there. But historically speaking, ancient sources overwhelmingly connect Moloch with the image of a bull rather than an owl. The owl association is largely a modern development. The older traditions, at least the ones that have survived, point instead toward a bronze bull. And perhaps this leaves us with an even deeper mystery. If Moloch truly existed, why was the sacrifice of children so important? Why not cattle? Why not grain? Why not gold or silver? Why sons? Why daughters? And why did so many ancient people believe that such a terrible offering was worth making? Moloch is often confused with other ancient deities, especially Baal and Chemosh. Many people assume they were simply different names for the same being. But history is rarely that simple. Baal was primarily known as a storm and fertility god. Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites, and Moloch remains one of the most mysterious names in the entire ancient world. Unlike Baal, whose mythology is comparatively better preserved, or Chemosh, whose connection to the Moabites is clearly established, Moloch remains surrounded by uncertainty. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes him so terrifying, because it is difficult to understand something when even scholars disagree over what it truly was. In the case of Chemosh, the Bible gives us one of the most disturbing stories in the Old Testament. In 2 Kings chapter 3, King Mesha of Moab found himself facing complete defeat. His armies had suffered devastating losses. Even an attempt to break through enemy lines with 700 swordsmen had failed. With his kingdom collapsing around him, he took his firstborn son, the heir to the throne, and sacrificed him publicly upon the city wall. Not secretly, not inside a temple, but before both armies. And immediately afterward, the Bible records something strange. Great wrath came upon Israel, and Israel withdrew. The reason is never explained. Was it God's wrath, human outrage, fear, or something else entirely? The text remains silent. For thousands of years, readers have debated that mystery. Chemosh, therefore, became associated with a very different type of sacrifice. Not the image of infants placed within a bronze idol, but the sacrifice of a king's own heir. A sacrifice performed publicly, a sacrifice made during war, and perhaps a sacrifice intended to show absolute devotion. Ancient writers also noticed similarities between child sacrifice and the worship of Kronos. The Greeks knew him as Kronos. The Romans called him Saturn. And according to mythology, Kronos himself devoured his own children. Centuries later, historians such as Diodorus Siculus described Carthaginian sacrifices that they associated with Kronos. Meanwhile, Acts chapter 7 verse 43 quotes the prophet Amos and mentions, "You took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan." Because of this verse, some later interpreters connected Moloch, Remphan, Saturn, and Kronos together. But such connections remain debated. No universal agreement exists, and perhaps that is one of the greatest frustrations surrounding Moloch. Every answer seems to create even more questions. Human sacrifice itself was not unique to Moloch. Ancient writers accused several gods of receiving blood offerings: Baal, Chemosh, Tanit, Kronos, and many others. But few became so strongly associated with the sacrifice of children. And perhaps this is why Moloch survived in memory while many other gods faded into obscurity. Because even thousands of years later, humanity still remembers him with fear. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery is not Moloch himself. Perhaps the greater mystery is humanity. Why would people do such things? Modern people often assume ancient civilizations were ignorant, but ancient people possessed minds no different from our own. They loved their children. They cried. They feared death. They experienced war, disease, famine, and desperation. Perhaps those fears pushed them toward rituals they believed would save their communities. Perhaps they genuinely believed these sacrifices worked. Or perhaps they simply inherited traditions from generations before them. Because people rarely commit terrible acts believing they are doing evil. More often, they believe they are doing what is necessary. And that possibility is perhaps more disturbing than anything else. Interestingly, sacrifice itself was not foreign to ancient Israel. For centuries, animal sacrifice stood at the center of Israelite worship. Leviticus describes burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings. The shedding of blood was deeply connected to ideas of atonement and purification. Later, Christianity would teach that Jesus Christ became the final sacrifice. According to Hebrews chapter 10, no further sacrifices were necessary. But perhaps one of the most difficult stories in the Bible appears much earlier. Genesis chapter 22. God commands Abraham, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love." For generations, readers have struggled with this passage. Why would God ask such a thing? Yet before Abraham acts, an angel intervenes, a ram is provided, and Isaac is spared. Jewish tradition wrestled deeply with this story. Some rabbis saw it as the ultimate test of obedience. Others viewed it as God's rejection of human sacrifice itself. The Mishnah and the Talmud strongly condemned Moloch worship. Rabbinic traditions considered it among the darkest forms of idolatry. And over time, the Valley of Hinnom became associated with Gehenna and divine judgment. Yet despite thousands of years of study, the mystery remains. Was Moloch truly a god? Was it merely the name of a ritual? Was there another deity behind the sacrifice? Or were ancient people simply interpreting coincidences as divine answers? No theory has achieved universal agreement, and perhaps none ever will. Because history has left us with fragments, broken memories, ancient accusations, and unanswered questions. But one thing remains undeniable: children died. Parents sacrificed what they loved most, and entire civilizations believe such acts brought them closer to the divine. Which raises a question that may never truly disappear. What are human beings willing to sacrifice in exchange for hope? Jeremiah chapter 32 verse 35 records God saying, "They built the high places of Baal and sacrificed their sons and daughters to Moloch, though I never commanded such a thing, nor did it enter my mind." Those words have echoed through history for thousands of years, and perhaps they explain why Moloch remains such a disturbing figure, because Moloch represents something deeper than one ancient god. He represents humanity's endless search for power, for protection, for prosperity, and for hope, no matter the cost. Whatever the truth may be, one thing remains certain. Few mysteries in the ancient world are darker than those surrounding Moloch. And perhaps the greatest mystery is not who Moloch was, but why humanity has always been willing to give so much in search of the divine. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And let me know your thoughts below. Was Moloch a god, a ritual, or something else entirely? Until next time, goodbye for now.